So my talk, unlike some of the other talks and sessions yesterday, which set the scene and then showed that there are many linkages that we need to understand better from a substantive point of view, my focus here is on methods, namely on methods, how to evaluate nutrition and health impacts of agricultural innovations. Before showing you how this can be done and how it has been done in the past, let me give you some motivation. I mean, it's not important probably in this audience to set the scene in the sense that we need to acknowledge that many, if not most, of those people who are undernourished and suffer from poor health are not only living in rural areas, but depend on agriculture, not only as a source of food, but also as a source of income and employment. And therefore, agriculture certainly has to be one of the key sectors and entry points to improve these people's nutrition and health. And agricultural innovations can have a role in that and need to have an important role in that. I think that's also well understood. And when I'm talking here of agricultural innovations, and I'm particularly or deliberately saying innovations, which is certainly including technologies, technical innovations, but it's also including institutional innovations, so a very broad understanding of innovations. And we know that agricultural innovations do impact nutrition and health, but if you're honest, then there are also lots of open questions about how exactly, in what magnitude, and what technologies and what innovations exactly in what directions. And especially so at the micro level. Yes, we do know that productivity increases in agriculture lead to price decreases, and that helps access food for market consumers. So these links at the macro level are well established, but at the micro level we know significantly less. And that doesn't mean that there aren't impact studies at the micro level. I mean, those of you who are working in agricultural economics and related fields, you know that there are tons of studies looking at the impacts of technologies and innovations at the micro level. But most of these studies look at productivity. They look at what are the yield effects for certain crops, cost of production. Some of them look at income, but even income in a broad sense, so going beyond farm income, is often not the target of the classical impact evaluations. And if you look at how many of these impact studies actually look explicitly at nutrition and health, we have to say we have very, very few. And I find that a little bit surprising, and especially so in a CGIAR context, because many, if not most, of the CG centers have somehow improving food and nutrition security as their mission statement. And when it comes to really showing the evidence, then we're primarily looking at yields and income. I think is not enough. Now one could argue, okay, but if we can always say that higher yields lead to better nutrition, then perhaps we don't need to go any further, but we certainly know that this is not always the case. It may be sometimes true in a calorie sense, but even that is perhaps not always true, and it's certainly not always true if you look at the other components of nutrition, diversity, micronutrients, and that stuff. So one of the first statements that I would like to make, and that's also one of my conclusions already. Don't worry, I'm not yet done, but it's one of my conclusions, that future impact analysis of agricultural innovations need to look at nutrition and health outcomes more explicitly. And I want to stress here that I'm not only meaning with this agricultural innovations that are directly designed to improve nutrition. So I'm not only talking about biofortification or kitchen gardens or so. I talk about agricultural innovations more broadly, even those that are not primarily designed for improving nutrition. If you want to understand agriculture, nutrition, health linkages, then we certainly need to understand what all of these innovations and technologies developed out there do in terms terms of nutrition and health at the micro level for farming and rural households. So how can we do this? Are standard approaches available that we can just plug into all the impact assessments out there? Well, the answer is no, there aren't standard approaches available, and that's why I've decided to focus on this topic during this presentation. The intention is definitely not, to show you a blueprint of this is how it's being done. That would not be possible, but I'd like to discuss possible approaches that can be used, that have been used, and point out what needs to be considered when you're doing such types of analysis. Here's an overview about the rest of my talk. I'll start with a conceptual framework. There is agricultural innovation and there is nutrition and health impact, but what's in between? If we analyze impacts, then it's not enough just to look at the outcome variable, but we need to model and understand the impact pathways. We need to talk about metrics, metrics of nutrition and metrics of health, which are closely related, but not the same thing. I'll briefly broach upon designing impact studies. We had some discussion about this already yesterday in one of the breakout sessions, and then I'll show you a few selected empirical examples building on some of our work. Now, let's start with the conceptual framework, and this is really focusing at the micro level. For farm households, there's the agricultural innovation, and there is food consumption or nutrition outcome. That pointer, okay, not working, is down here. So what are the pathways? The first classical pathway is, okay, you have any innovation that helps to increase or affect the food quantity produced, and if the household is consuming what it produces, then that should affect food consumption and nutrition. We hope in a positive way, but there are many things in between, things like intra-household distribution, where gender and a number of other factors will play an important role. So that's the food quantity pathway. There's a food quality pathway. That may be things like biofortified crops, but it may also be things like dealing with aflatoxins technologies. There was one breakout session on food safety yesterday, which are going to affect food consumption and nutrition. And then there's a food diversity pathway. So think about introducing kitchen gardens or introducing livestock components into production systems, or introducing legumes into cereal production systems. Not all of this is always targeted towards nutrition, but it's going to affect nutrition in one way or the other. So that is the farm households producing and consuming what they produce, but that's certainly not the end of the story, because we are not only talking about pure subsistence households. There is products that are sold in the market, and there is also food that is purchased in markets, so that is certainly an additional pathway. And it can not only come from innovations in food crops and livestock commodities, but there may also be a link which is not necessarily through food production. So let's think about innovations in non-food cash crops. They're going to affect income, and that's likely to affect food consumption and nutrition in some way. I think also a very important pathway. Now, I mentioned nutrition and health is not exactly the same thing, but obviously they're related. So that's the link down here, which is deliberately pointing into both directions. Yes, nutrition does affect health, but also health affects the absorptive capacity of the human body for nutrients and so on. That is the path. These are the pathways through nutrition, but we also know that agricultural innovations can affect health through other pathways, thinking in terms of occupational health hazards, pesticide exposure of farmers and farm workers, zoonotic diseases, or you know, waterborne vectors of infectious diseases, malaria in irrigation schemes. This is also something we need to take care of, and that's not all through nutrition. And then we certainly know, to close that loop here, that household income is going to affect health, and we know that rising incomes and living standards lead to greater demand and awareness of health and sanitation issues. So these are, very broadly speaking, the pathways, and obviously one could add many facets here to make it more detailed, but that should suffice here in order to design impact studies and better understand how innovations impact nutrition and health. So once we understand that, we need to think about metrics, and obviously measuring nutrition is important if you want to do quantitative impact analysis. So how do we do that? We talked about that yesterday a little bit, but probably the four most prominent or well-known approaches are these. Subjective food security assessment, so asking households about their subjective assessment of access to food. The Household Food Insecurity Access Scale is one example, but there are others which can be used for impact assessment. They haven't been used widely, but it can be done. Then food consumption-based measures, so be it through 24-hour recalls or 7-day or 14-day recalls at individual or at household level, which would also include dietary diversity scores based somehow on such data. Anthropometric measures, where we learned yesterday that they are not very sensitive and may be difficult to use in such impact assessments, and obviously clinical impact assessments, analyzing blood and so on. So these are available. Obviously, when we're doing impact analysis, we wouldn't take all four. So we need to understand the pros and cons, and we need to understand those things are not all measuring exactly the same thing. So when we are asking, I mean, what's the best way of doing it? The answer is it depends, and we need to know on what it depends. So some of the criteria that we need to look into when we're choosing the metric is, what type of agricultural innovation are we talking about, and what are the expected pathways? So if you're interested to have an innovation that we believe is affecting dietary diversity, well, we should probably not use stunting alone as the measure, but rather use some of the food consumption-based measures. Target groups is important. I mean, many of the typical food consumption-based data that economists are using is household-based. You can do it in an individual-based way, but it depends. I mean, do we have certain target groups within families in mind, or is it a broader assessment? The sample size, the regional coverage matters, you know, depending on what we choose. The cost of doing that may be quite different, and therefore we may also be interested in, okay, what are the resources that we have available? There are certainly other criteria, but I think these are some of the more important ones. And what about health, metrics of health? I mean, that is a topic that for many agricultural economists is even much more diverse, because what is health? I mean, in the end, we need to look at you know, bunch of different health outcomes, starting from infectious diseases like diarrhea, measles, and so on, malaria, but you know, going to cognitive development, IQ-based measures, going to premature death. So how can we measure that? Well, I mean, one straightforward and probably also one very important way of doing that is looking at the incidence rates and how these incidence rates of different adverse health outcomes change through certain innovations. That is fine, but whenever we are trying to compare different health outcomes, it's hard to say, well, is you know, a spell of of diarrhea worse than a spell of measles, or how many diarrhea cases is worth one child death. So these are ethical questions which we cannot answer based on incidence rates alone. We have to use some measures of trying to combine and aggregate the different health outcomes. And the most common approaches are either cost of illness approaches, where you're really using a budgeting approach of what are the health costs for treatment and lost work days and so on, or disability adjusted life years. I'm not going into details here. I will talk about one of this in one of the examples later on. But that's the metrics that can be used for impact assessment. So let's look into the design of impact studies. And remember, the idea is to evaluate the impact of agricultural innovations on health and nutrition. So collect data on the nutrition and health variables that we have decided are appropriate in our particular context for adopters and non-adopters of the innovation, and then compare. Well, that's the basic idea, but obviously there's an attribution problem. If you just compare between adopters and non-adopters of the innovation, then we can never be really sure, I mean, how much of the differences that we may observe is due to the innovation or due to other underlying factors that are unrelated to the innovation. Now, there is, almost a religious debate now about RCTs or not, and of course, assigning innovations randomly to avoid non-random selection bias is one way of doing that. So RCTs can play an important role in here, but I would also want to stress that it may not be useful all the time, and especially not as a standard tool in impact assessment for all different types of technologies. So we need to look also at other statistical ways of doing that, and whenever panel data with baseline and follow-up surveys is available, then differencing techniques can do a nice job of establishing net treatment effects. And even when there are only cross-section data, then it can be done if we design studies in a way that we find the right instruments for instrumental variable approaches or propensity score matching. Now, this is something that is certainly not unique for nutrition impacts. This holds in general, but we need, when we design studies, to be aware of what we need to take care of and certainly do our data collection and sampling properly. Now with this, I would like to lead over to a few empirical examples, and I should stress that the empirical examples I'm showing you are a little bit coincidental. They're definitely not meant to show you those types of innovations that have the biggest nutrition impacts. But I'm showing you what we have worked on in a context of productivity, and then also looked into nutrition and health impacts. So it's much more to demonstrate how some of these methodologies work. The first example I want to look into is tissue culture bananas, and that's an example focusing on Kenya. Now, in Kenya, banana is grown primarily for home consumption, so more than 50% of the bananas that are produced in smallholder households are consumed in the same households, but then also surplus is being sold in local markets. There's hardly any exports from Kenya and other East African countries to the international market. Now, what is tissue culture? Tissue culture is a technology where clean, pathogen-free planting material is produced in the laboratory through cloning techniques. The traditional way of propagation is through taking suckers from old banana plantations and using them for the establishment of new plantations. And the problem is that banana weevils and fungal pathogens and others are transferred through that process of using suckers, and that's something that is avoided when you're using tissue culture planters from the lab, which are more expensive, but which lead to more vigorous plant growth and also higher yields if combined with proper agronomic techniques. Now, that's yields. We looked at yields, but I don't want to, show you that. What I want to show you is what we did in order to analyze food security effects of that. And if you remember the different pathways, here we are thinking about pathways of food quantity and also of income, because banana is both. It's a food crop, but also to some extent a crop to generate cash. So we collected data from 385 farm households, including adopters and non-adopters, and we do find large and positive income effects, which I'm not showing you here. Food security, how did we measure that? And this is an example where we used a subjective way of food access. So we used the household food insecurity access scale, which many of you may be aware of. It was developed by USAID's Hunter project, and it was used to show relatively cheaply and easily food access and food security or insecurity. In a wide country context, it has been used. To my knowledge, it hasn't been used for impact assessment so far. I've learned yesterday, somebody was talking about it may be used currently in a number of studies, but I haven't seen that. So one of the questions is the tool as such includes 9 different questions, and those questions are over the last 30 days, did you or any other household member ever did not have enough access to this and that, or it's a battery of questions, and the question is, okay, how do we use these measures in impact assessment? You can certainly use answers to the individual questions, but we decided to use factor analysis to combine these 9 different questions and calculate indices. And we calculated 2 indices coming out of this factor analysis, namely a food insecurity index and a severe food insecurity index. Now, one thing that I should mention with respect to these indices, they are by definition standard normally distributed. So they have a mean value of 0 and a standard deviation of 1 across the sample you're looking at. That has advantages for impact assessment because in a relative sense you can always say who's doing better than, which household is doing better than the other household. There's a clear ranking. Okay, but in an absolute sense, it's a little bit more tricky because you can't easily say those are food secure and those are food insecure households, because the mean value of 0 is always the mean value of your sample, and if your sample is completely food insecure, the mean value will still be 0. Now, that's one of the things with our indices. One can probably approach that in a different way. More work is required, but I'm just mentioning that this is potentially one weakness, but then for impact assessment also perhaps one strength. Now here we see that the non-adopters of TC technology, they have positive values for both indices, and the adopters have negative values. And these are indices of food insecurity, so we can say the adopters are less food insecure than the adopters. And that looks nice. The technology may play a role here, but that's just a comparison, okay? So there may be confounding factors, there may be selection bias. We need to deal with that. We did that by running regression models, taking the indices as dependent variables and running treatment effect models with a number of covariates, which I'm not showing you. And we are using instrumental variable models in order to avoid or at least reduce potential issues of of endogeneity and selection bias. So what we see here is that tissue culture adoption, which is here a dummy variable, the treatment variable, does reduce food insecurity and severe food insecurity in a significant way, and also substantially if we consider that the standard deviation of that index is 1. So that is a relatively large effect. And that is one example for subjective ways of measuring food security. The second example that I want to show you relates to BT cotton in India, that many of you are aware of. Now, BT cotton provides host plant resistance to major cotton pests, and now some of you will say, hey, come on, India, even Indians don't eat cotton, so what's the food security and nutrition effect? But you know, I've shown you that through the income pathways there may certainly be some effects that we could expect. And it's relevant in India because cotton is produced by small-scale farm households, many of whom are poor and food insecure, and therefore we're looking into that. That, by the way, is the larva of cotton bollworm, which is the target pest of the BT genes that were inserted there. BT cotton was commercialized in 2002, and nowadays there are over 7 million smallholder farmers, which is over 90% of the cotton in India that is under BT technology. And we have collected very comprehensive data in 4 waves, panel data that is representative for southern and central India. And we used panel fixed effects, one way of dealing with selection bias, to show that chemical pesticides were reduced, yields were increased, and profits were increased significantly through adoption of BT cotton technology. Now, so far so fine, that's not yet measuring nutrition. One could argue, okay, if they are better off, then they may have better nutrition, but we wanted to know more about this, and that's what I'm going to show you. Here we use food consumption-based data that we collected. Now, this is 30-day recall data. It's relatively long to do nutrition analysis, but still was sufficiently detailed in order to get a good sense of what the households consume and how their diets look like. And obviously that is looking at the whole diets. You know, some impact studies for food crops only look at how has food consumption for this particular crop changed. No, it's important to look at the whole diet and understand how diets are affected. Now, we use these data for the quantities of different food items consumed to convert to calorie consumption per adult equivalent, taking household structure into account. These are descriptive results. These are the density functions of calorie consumption for adopters and non-adopters with our 4 waves of the sample. And we do see that the adopters of BT do have higher average calorie consumption. The distribution is statistically dominant. Definitely, we also see that in an Indian context, per adult male, 2,300 kilocalories are recommended, and we see that the share of people below is higher for the non-adopters than the adopters. Now, again, this is descriptive. This is not yet fully accounting for any selection bias. So we were running models here, treatment effect models with panel data and household fixed effects. And we can show that BT adoption per hectare of BT increases calorie consumption by 74 kilocalories per adult equivalent. And if you look at this at the household level, because households have on average more than 1 hectare, they may have around 2 hectares, this leads to 145 kilocalories per adult equivalent additionally through BT cotton. This is about 5% adding 2 calories. And you know, with these effects, we can look at treatment effects on the treated and on the untreated, and do some simulations of what it means for food security. We have done that, and we could show that BT adoption has reduced food insecurity in a calorie sense by 15 to 20% among cotton producers in India. That is calories, and now many of you would say, okay, I mean, calories is one thing, and we wanted to know more about food quality. And one way of looking at food quality is calories derived from non-staple foods, which includes pulses, which includes fruits and vegetables and animal products. And we have done that because we have detailed food consumption data, and we find that the treatment effects of BT adoption for non-staple calorie consumption in India is also significant, increasing even somewhat over-proportionally by 7% as compared to 5% for the total calories. And we even went further, and that's something you can do with these food consumption data. We looked into micronutrient consumption for 3 of the important micronutrients that are relevant from a public health perspective in India: iron, zinc, and vitamin A. And we can show that for all 3 of these micronutrients, the consumption levels increased, and especially for vitamin A, it's close to a 10% increase in vitamin A consumption. Now, we need to be aware when using such data that bioavailability is not you know, perfectly taken care of, and those things. But I still think that food consumption data can help a lot in order to understand what's happening, and obviously not only for BT cotton. I told you I'm not showing you technologies that may improve nutrition in the best way, but showing how the methodologies can be used. Now, sticking to the BT cotton example, I also wanted to show you one of the other pathways, namely how health is directly affected. And I've told you that BT cotton adoption has reduced chemical pesticide use in India significantly, by about 40 to 50%. And well, how do these smallholder farmers apply chemical pesticides? They do that manually with backpack sprayers and usually hardly any protective clothing. So they are exposed to quite a bit of pesticides when they're applying them in the field. And that leads to cases of poisoning with skin, eye, breathing, stomach, and a number of other problems, acute problems, and probably also chronic problems. And we have used our data where we collected information on these aspects to show that BT adoption decreased the incidence of these cases of poisoning by 0.26 per hectare. Now, that may sound much or not much depending on how you look at it, but you know, when you multiply it by the 10 million hectares under BT cotton, it means 2.6 million fewer cases of pesticide poisoning in an Indian context. And we have used the cost of illness approach to show you what the dimension is. We're getting to about 15 million lower costs of illness, and this is only taking into account the acute costs of pesticide poisoning. There are long-term things that we haven't measured here. Prabhu Kingali has pioneered some of this work back in the Philippines. We haven't done that kind of medical analysis, but even for just the acute health problems, it's a significant dimension. So now one other thing, coming back to the impact pathways. So we have looked at this here. We have now looked for the pesticide poisoning thing at this, but can we not also look at health effects that are somehow coming through the nutrition pathway? And the answer is yes, certainly you can do that. And How can we do that? Well, malnutrition has or leads to adverse health outcomes, and these adverse health outcomes, however they are, I mean, each nutrient deficiency leads to slightly different adverse health outcomes, and if we know these, then we also know that these cause a health burden for individuals and for society. And one thing that one can do is to use that DALI's approach, disability-adjusted life years approach, that combines mortality and morbidity into one index. That's a way of doing or calculating global burden of disease studies. And it has been refined in a nutrition context, especially also for micronutrients in the last couple of years. My own group was involved in that. In the end, the cost of adverse health outcomes of any particular nutritional deficiency is expressed in the number of DALIs lost, which is years lost due to mortality plus years with disability, and each disability of any adverse health outcome is multiplied with a disability weight to make it comparable with years of life lost due to mortality. Now, the idea is, if we measure that DALI is lost in a situation without the innovation, and then we compare that in a situation with the innovation, and here's an example where we expect the health cost to be reduced, then the difference is the health benefit of the innovation. And it can be done for things like Bt cotton and the reduction in vitamin A and iron deficiencies or so. We haven't done that, but it can be done. Just in order to show you how this is working, I wanted to briefly refer to one older study that we have done for biofortification, also for India from an ex-ante perspective. So what you're doing is, and we're looking here at biofortified wheat and rice with those three micronutrients, Harley Harvest Plus technologies, and these here, and golden rice. And now these are the number of DALIs lost. This is the health burden of iron, zinc, and vitamin A deficiency in India, expressed in millions of DALIs lost. You know, this is including lots of detailed calculations coming to those values. Okay, how much can this be reduced through biofortification? You show policymakers that iron-rich wheat and rice reduces the DALIs lost by 2.3 million. Well, policymakers may not fully understand. So you can express that just in a percentage term of the initial cost, and that is perhaps easier to understand. Around 60% of the health cost associated with these deficiencies is reduced. And we have talked yesterday about it's not only about effectiveness, it's also about cost effectiveness and how worthwhile it is to invest. You can also use such calculations to calculate internal rates of returns of investments into this research and development. So that can be used also for ex-post analysis, and I believe it's an interesting approach. And with this, I want to come to a few concluding remarks, summarizing that most studies on the impact of agricultural innovations are not looking primarily at nutrition and health. Most of them don't look at nutrition and health at all. And I think it should be done. And it should basically become almost a standard tool, just like looking at yield and income in impact assessment. Now, this is important to better understand what works, certainly we have our suspicions and we know a lot, but I think it's important to also demonstrate that in a rigorous way in impact assessment work. Now, interesting methodological approaches are available. I've shown you a few of them, but certainly much more work is required. There are open questions of what are really the right metrics and in what context. It depends on the question. Issues of intra-household distribution and gender, we haven't fully included that in the studies I've shown you, but it's definitely work that needs to be done. Efficient survey design. I mean, it's very easy to say, okay, we add this and we add that to a survey, and but that cannot be the idea. That's not efficient. So we need to understand really what we want and do that in an efficient way. And I hope I have roused your interest a little bit. Thanks for your attention.